white hair that fell all the way down his shirtless back. A patch of gray flesh was spread across his right arm. The contrast of the strange mark against the mutant's red flesh made it nigh impossible to miss. A birthmark, or some kind of skin disease. The other 5 people seemed normal at a glance. Yet he could see that one, a blonde woman wearing plate mail, possessed ears with a slight point to them. Another elf, perhaps? Maybe a subspecies? Before he could make out more details, he had to pull his finger back. A pale, square-faced man of middling height, and wearing a red cape and leather armor, had seemingly caught sight of Hoplite, his eyes coming to rest exactly on Hoplite's tree. It was likely that Hoplite had pulled his finger back before it could be seen. Yet that man seemed to have keen eyes. Keener than most to catch sight of Hoplite's fingertip. Did that man have bionic eyes? No normal human should have been able to spot something as small as a fingertip so quickly and accurately. Perhaps the man had seen an insect instead? Or maybe he mistook Hoplite's finger for a bird. If the stranger had indeed spotted Hoplite in that brief instant, then his position was compromised. Did you guys see that? One of them, likely this square-faced man, asked. See what? Sir, wow. Oh. A woman's voice replied. Potential hostiles. Hoplite told Lance as drew the Magnus from his back. Lance's brow furrowed in confusion for a brief instant before she heard the drifting conversation between the strangers. Then she drew her daggers. You saw them on you called it a motion tracker, yes? Lance asked in a whisper. Yes. Be ready to attack or retreat if they become aggressive. Flank them if you can. Hoplite told her, rounding the trunk of the tree to greet surprised eyes. The strangers had all turned to stare goggle-eyed at Hoplite, who stood tall and ready to start blasting hot lead. He stared right back at the strangers, his shotgun not yet aimed but ready to be, if the need arose. Hoplite would react appropriately based on how these people behaved. Suddenly, the square-faced man walked toward Hoplite, his face set with curious determination. Hoplite then promptly aimed his shotgun toward the pale man, and the stranger stopped dead in his tracks. Even if he didn't understand what a gun was, he clearly understood that whatever Hoplite was holding was a weapon. Identify, Hoplite ordered. The strangers all looked at each other, the two-faced mutant staring at him with those unsettling, pitch-black eyes. That one he could put down with a blast of the Magnus, without having to get close, but Hoplite supposed the same could be said of all of these people. None of them wore armor that could possibly stop these shells. I'm the warrior known as Kitka. The man stuttered, sorry, I just wanted a closer look at what you were. Didn't mean offense, Mr. Golem. The elf woman in full plate then stepped forward, placing a fist to her chest plate as the pale man took a few steps back. I am Twindil, a paladin of Athena, the pillar god of tranquility, she said soothingly, as if she had heard heat in his monotone. He searched those green eyes of hers, but there wasn't anything but confidence in those eyes. A paladin? She certainly didn't look like one. The generation of super soldiers before Hoplite had been called paladins, but they weren't all that common nowadays. Most had met their ends serving in the war, and few new paladins had been made after Project Chimera's resounding success. Hoplite had met and even fought side by side with a few in his younger days, and they all shared Hoplite's disposition. After all, paladins went through the exact same training as a Hoplite, just without the mutations that were involved with Project Chimera. This woman did not have those same cold, empty eyes. They seemed to be filled to the brim with life. She actually smiled at him when she saw his head cocked toward her, the small scar on her lip only pulling it down slightly. No, this girl could not be Turnen personnel, not with those ears. And that gear. Hoplite then cocked his helmet in Kitka's direction again, simply to let the man know that Hoplite still had him well within his sight. Kitka then coughed forcefully before he began rubbing the back of his head, looking away from Hoplite as he spoke. I am a tongue of Zod, he said, seemingly straining to speak the words. Whoever this man was, Hoplite could tell that he didn't speak very often based on the croak in his deep voice. Either that or he smoked an unhealthy amount of tobacco, much like how many sergeants in the Marines do. Kitka then lifted up the back of his hand, displaying it to show that it had been branded with the image of a furrowed tongue. He had heard mention of the tongues of Zod before in the Harkhold. There had been mention of calling for their aid in dealing with the encroaching fiends. Were these strangers all tongues of Zod? Likely not. Twindle likely would have introduced herself just as Kitka had if that were so. It was still uncertain as to if these strangers were hostiles, but so far Hoplite did not think that they presented any immediate threat. They had tried opening talks, albeit strangely with Kitka's behavior. Perhaps the man was simply socially inept. Yes. He didn't seem the type to speak much to others based on that croak to his throat and the silvery paleness of his flesh. Hoplite was all too familiar with that sensation of speaking far too often. Other than Kitka's strangeness, however, these people didn't seem to be hostile. The red-skinned mutant standing further back in the group then began inching toward the door to the pod, and Hoplite's body kicked into motion, raising his shotgun and aiming it directly at the mutant. "Step away from the pod now," Hoplite shouted, his booming voice causing all to flinch, save for the huge mutant. That one held its composure. Failure to comply with these orders will result in your immediate execution, he ordered harshly, stomping forward a few steps while keeping an eye on everyone surrounding him. Okay. Was just curious was all," the mutant said. His voice was filled with undercurrents of mischievousness, like those hordes of lower-ranking Marines that preferred to goof off rather than be productive. From his rear camera, Hoplite could see Lance quickly pass from tree to tree, going almost completely unnoticed. Despite her adept maneuvering through the woods, however, it still seemed that Kitka had seen her, his face growing pale as he mouthed the words, "Watch her," silently. Lance's position was compromised to Kitka, but the man didn't seem interested in outing her hiding place for some reason. Maybe he had already been seeing watchers darting about, and had simply chosen to ignore them up until now. "Name's Elam," the red-skinned mutant said, drawing Hoplite's attention. "And anyway, it's not like it's yours. We were here first. I claim this star for us," Elam declared, gesturing to his companions, who all stared daggers at him in response, save for one, a girl with her eyes firmly set on the ground. Elam seemed to be waiting for his companions to back him up, and when they didn't, he pursed his lips in irritation. He scratched at one of his black horns as he backed away from the pod, compressing his lips to a fine line and staring longingly at the crashed shuttle. "That is Turnen property," Hoplite said, seeing Lance emerge from behind a completely different tree than the one he had seen her dart behind. She sheathed her daggers and began almost casually approaching Kitka. Why was she compromising the flank? Was there something she knew about these strangers that he didn't? She gestured for the man to approach her, and Kitka flinched, seizing up for a brief instant before finally he started to slowly inch toward her. No one besides Hoplite seemed to have noticed this. "There are no claims. Stay away from that pod," Hoplite ordered in a low, menacing tone. "You won't be warned again." Elam then lifted his chin. "What about the international claims law?" he asked in a confident tone. "It dictates that—" He paused, his confident tone waning as he went on. "It says that, if I find a thing, make a claim upon it, that it's mine." Twindle then shot a withering glare at Elam. "There is no such law," she shouted with exasperation. Elam then began grumbling something under his breath, looking away from the elfin armor, to instead seemingly admire a fallen branch. Twindle maintained the accusing glare for a full few seconds, before turning back to Hoplite with a sigh, her brows creased apologetic. Hoplite had overheard an almost similar conversation, much like the interaction between he and Elam just had. It had been between a couple of exo troops concerning a cup of ice cream. The two had almost come to blows. The soldiers had been strangely irritated about it. Whatever ice cream tasted like, it still shouldn't have been good enough for someone to fight over it. Indeed, Elam looked as irritated as those soldiers had, knowing that he could not claim Hoplite's pod for himself. Of course, this was a serious situation, not something as petty as ice cream. Yet Hoplite found himself recalling that interaction for hints on how to proceed here. It was an irritating thought. There was no need to defuse the situation with Elam. It was enough that Hoplite had ordered the mutant to step away from the shuttle. Nothing more was needed. Hoplite then noticed the other watchers in the trees above them. It seemed there were about 5 there, all staring silently at him and the strangers. Were they here before, or had they been following these people? Lance had told him that one of the many duties of a watcher was to observe trespassers until they left the forest, and that meant following them until they were gone. If they were causing harm to the forest, either by logging or poaching, they'd be dealt with swiftly and violently. What had they been doing here? Had they truly been here this whole time, or did they just arrive? If it was the former, then could they have been scheming a way to break into his shuttle? It was certainly possible, but thankfully, the durable tungsteel alloy making up the pod would ensure that nothing these elves had could bust through. Still, Hoplite wouldn't allow himself to be lax about a potential break-in. He'd need to make sure none of them managed to see the access code for the pod, else Hoplite may return to find his shuttle completely ransacked. Perhaps that was why Lance had broken cover. Confidence in her comrades to swoop in if things went south, perhaps, but it was still a foolish thing to do. There were far too many unknowns here to assume safety. He then turned his attention back to Elam, who stared back, seemingly unconcerned. The red mutant then crossed his arms, fully turning away from Hoplite with an irritated huff. "Never heard of turbot, or whatever the hells you called it. Keep it then. Fine-eyed. Well, I suppose I will allow you to retain possession of the discovered goods. No use in us killing each other over it," Elam said, as if it were his to give away in the first place. Hoplite then looked to the blond man wearing the red headband then. Seeing that he too wore plate armor similar to Twindle's, though his was painted a shade of gold rather than silvery gray. The man stood next to the two-faced mutant, a hand wrapped around the shaft of a large warhammer, with its square head planted firmly in the soil. It was an intricate piece of work, the large square metal head made of shining steel. Its wooden shaft was engraved with images of monstrous creatures, one of which looked to resemble the two-faced mutant. The man then leaned his weight into the hammer and began shaking his head. "I'm Alistair," the blond man said, looking again toward Hoplite. "This here is the angel, and my Eidolon Balmio." He finished, gesturing with a nod to the two-faced mutant I am sanctioned. "Do not worry about me being pillar-born." Hoplite was of a height with the creature that Alistair had named Balmio. The so-called angel glared at him, its upper human arms crossed over its broad chest. "That," Hoplite started in a deadpan, "is a mutant." Alistair stared confusion at Hoplite, and Balmio's upper half frowned at Hoplite, as the lower half continued to lick its own eyeballs. "No," Alistair said, with a shake of his head. "He is an angel from the astral plane. I can summon him and dismiss him at will. I am Athair Golem. Surely you know what that entails," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Hoplite did not argue the point, nor did he explain that he was really a human, not a golem. He instead turned his attention to the woman that had been staring at the ground. She had an eerily symmetrical face, bordering on unnatural. Her blue and green eyes lifted from the ground finally, and Hoplite felt a strange tugging in his gut. Almost like a primal fear? Fear. No, it could not be fear. He had felt true fear on board the Sparrow when he had been certain he'd been about to die. This was just a strange uneasiness, as if the woman's very existence were unnatural. Uncanny indeed. There was some kind of mutation besides the heterochromia there, though he could not place it purely based on her appearance. She began after a brief second, "am Nolvi." With that, Nolvi began staring at the forest floor, seemingly zoning off the very instant those eyes found the ground. She wore a heavy cloak that was made of stout brown leather, concealing much of her body and some of the thin staff she held gently in both hands. A leather cloak in this heat? Hoplite's body and armor had been outfitted with flexible Kelvinite piping, keeping his body temperature at a constant and normal for a Hoplite. It was likely that Nolvi had no such piping implanted beneath her skin. Why would she be wearing such a heavy-duty cloak? She must have been concealing weapons beneath it. He'd need to keep a keen eye on her hands in case she tried to pull one out. Alistair shook his head with a sigh before hefting the warhammer over his shoulder, the wooden shaft colliding with the plate armor with a gentle clank. "She is a bit vacuous. Do not mind her," he said in a suffering tone. Nolvi's eyes flashed up at Alistair for a brief instant before looking back down to the ground, and for some reason, Alistair let out a yelp, cradling his rear end a moment before muttering something under his breath. It was as if he had just been struck, though by what Hoplite didn't know. There was nothing that Hoplite could see that could have hit the man. Lance and Kidga were speaking more animatedly now, though they maintained a quiet whisper. The man was looking more drained, talking to her, than he had, speaking with Hoplite. These people did not seem hostile, but that didn't mean that Lance should have emerged yet. After all, the situation was still unresolved. He needed to question everyone, and then clear these people out of here. They must have found his pod by chance, so what was their original objective before stumbling across it? Perhaps they were heading for the Fiend Wall. Before he could pursue that train of thought further, the sixth stranger, an old-looking elf wearing a Black Watcher's outfit, approached Lance, big dark bags under aged green eyes. Was this man retired from working the Feywood? He had to be, else why would he be here with these strangers, and not darting through the trees above? Furrows carved their way through his skin, and he held himself in a slight hunch, bushy dark eyebrows drooping down nearly to brush his cheekbones. His long dark hair was held back in a single ponytail, not a single gray among that head of black, despite the wrinkles on his face. An old elf. Seemed this mutation had a lifespan after all. That begged the question, how long had this elf been alive? Lance claimed that elves were biologically immortal unless taken by disease or wounds. But this wrinkled bony man certainly looked anything but unaged. Instead of saying anything, the elder elf simply sat on the ground, staring uncaringly at Hoplite for a moment before looking at Alistair. "Got any food?" the wrinkly elf asked, his gravelly tones marred and scratchy from countless years of use.